Welcome to this session. It's called From Micro to Meta, and welcome to SF24. And this session is particularly about, I guess, my personal reflection too about how the Dialogic Orientation Quadrant came about. But then while I was doing that, I was so thankful that every single part of Dialogic Orientation Quadrant actually has a history. It has a story and a history. And I think I would love to share that. So it's titled From Micro to Meta and 12 Lessons from My Mentors. And hopefully this is useful to you. And that's my hope anyway. And as you know, this is something that I would love to actually engage all of you to think together because you will hear some names that you might know. Yeah. So hopefully you're able to actually join in. Well, let me tell you what the meta is about, because in the larger communities that I am part of, the Dialogic Orientation Quadrant is known as the meta model, like the model that rules all the other. No, I'm kidding. It's a model that you can use to study other models. So it's called meta model. But I also wanted to honor where it comes from, because this is micro-analysis informed approach. So here's the beginning. So this is me, pretty recent actually teaching or talking about this quadrant. So as you can see, I'm telling some people about this quadrant. It really takes about 5 minutes to talk about it, but I wanted to show you something that I've never done before. Here's a photo of me when I was about 20. So when I was about 20 years old, an entire university, I looked like this. And different hats. I think I have 17 different baseball cap. And I show up to school every day like this. And my background actually is I studied life sciences. And then I went back to school to study psychology. And then along with that, I did some religious studies. So I was like really deep in science. So then I was working in neuroscience lab, and my job was to code with, I don't know how many of you know this language, Linux. Have you heard of this thing called Linux? So my job was, it's a virtual reality lab where people have this big sort of, I guess, glasses device. And then their job is to, they're on a bike and then they see these images, and then we were studying the response time. So when they're biking, and if there's barrier, then how fast they can actually brake. I don't know why we're studying that. But you know what was so interesting is the professor's name was, last name was Sun. So it's Dr. Sun. And the funniest thing was that, you know how I'm Moon, last name is Moon, and he's Dr. Sun. I'm not kidding. So many people actually asked me, are you related? I'm like, this is ridiculous. But anyway, now it's funny, but back then it was like every day somebody would ask me, is that your uncle? I'm like, no. Anyway, that was my job, as well as animal behaviors lab. I was working in a lab. The reason why I was working in the lab a lot is because my high school guidance counselor, because I came here when I was in high school, so I didn't speak the language. So then guidance counselor said, you know, you really shouldn't be doing anything that's interactive with people because you don't speak the language. So why don't you work in a lab? That will be the best fitting job for you. And then I told her that, you know, but I want to be a teacher. And she's like, no, because you don't speak the language. So stick to the lab work. So then I thought, okay, I'll do that. So I was working in an animal behavior lab, and my job was to watch videos, countless videos. Overnight, I was just sitting there watching videos of postpartum gerbils behavior. And it was precursor to behavior therapy that I study afterwards, that I have to check every time they hump. So then, humping behavior of postpartum gerbil. That was my job. So anyway, there you go. Also, at the time, I was working as an organist. And one thing I remember from that time is organist, there's no shortcut. So slow practice is something that I remember. And I still work as an organist. And of course, my last little bit from the university years, I was working as behavior therapy intern. And you will see why some of these things become actually pretty relevant later on. And then, oh, hello, hello, people joining just now. Feel free to say hi in the chat box, by the way. And here's me, like clean up a little bit nicer. But there's a whole period of time that I thought I was blonde. So there you go. And then 2001 is when I walked into this class. Okay, dog, stop moving. There you go. I have my dog right beside me and she keeps on moving and she slides off. Sorry about that. So there you go. Better. And then I walked into this class called sports coaching. So how many of you actually heard of this thing called Grow coaching model? Grow? Yeah. They were talking about that. 2001. I'm like, yeah, this is so new. I loved it. And then I went to study lean management, person-centered behavior therapy. And then I actually got a job as a manager, working with people with developmental disability for about 7, 8 years, I would say. And I was in charge of staff training development and also organizational development and so on and so forth. So that was my sort of initial getting into different fields and sort of experiencing it. So hopefully this is kind of like a little surprise to you that I do have this kind of background. Some people think that I actually studied like arts or something. I didn't. And then I remember as I was actually doing my master's degree, I walked into this classroom thinking it was organization and development because that's what I was doing. And I was there halfway in. The professor didn't say anything about, as many of you know the story, professor didn't say anything about OD. So I had to ask him. I said, Dr. Warner, how is this whole empathy, goal setting, and that prefer future, how is it related to OD? And I remember him actually saying, what do you mean OD, like overdose? And I realized that we are speaking different languages. So he was a psychologist teaching this class called Solution Focused Brief Therapy. I walked into a wrong classroom thinking, because I was really, with the directions, I sometimes feel slightly challenged. So that's how I met Solution Focused Brief Therapy. But before then, I was working with appreciative inquiry and team-based interventions and stuff like that. And then he said, Ron Warner said, why don't you come to this session? I invited this guy called Peter Szabo from Switzerland, and I think you will like him. So why don't you come? And just, he's going to teach something that's about coaching. And I'm like, oh, I know coaching. I did sports coaching. And I met this guy called Peter Szabo. How many of you know Peter Szabo? Yeah, some of you do. And for those of you who know Peter, what do you really appreciate about him? Let me ask you this. Put it in the chat box, please. What do you appreciate about this guy? Hmm? For those of you who know him, we're going to actually positive gossip through the entire thing, by the way, as you see these people. What do you appreciate about this guy? Yeah, for those of you who know him or who have heard of him. And it's somehow witty and quirky. My goodness. And yeah, so curious about you. And also um, that sparkle in his eyes. He was so curious. And I think for me, he got up to the board and he just wrote scribbled some things on. I'm like, what is this? Where's the PowerPoint? Like, hello. So I was like, what is this guy doing? And he was so playful. And I just realized now, after now having done the PhD in adult education, how profound that experience was for me. And I think for me, watching him sort of teach or facilitate a class has such profound impact on me. So he was the first, I was so mesmerized. I was in class just with my jaw like open. It's like, wow, wow, the whole time. That was my first introduction to solution focused coaching. And some of you might be familiar with this particular drawing. So he went up to the board. He drew something like that. And it's like a horizontal line. For those of you who know the DOQ, you see something happening here. And then he drew these two people sitting down together and he's like, so And then he talked about common factors and he talked about many different things. But one thing that really sort of inspired me from this experience was, remember, I was a psychology major, right? So then I specialized also in clinical and all those things. And I was working as a behavior therapist intern for some time. And then what happens is it was about the thoughts, internal processing, and all those things. And I was working as a manager for developmental disability sector. So then this idea of you and I doing something together was pretty new to me. That idea that it's not internal, but this is interaction. So that was my first lesson that I learned from Peter. Not only I learned this, but I learned everything actually from Peter about how to teach and how to do all these different things. And then of course you start mimicking like your mentor. And I remember mimicking like Peter without trying to, mimic, but it was such profound impact that I was doing that. And then as I was doing that, I think I was actually in Basel when I met this guy, like tall guy with a really deep voice, and he just walked in and he's like, "Hi," and this was Harry Corman. How many of you know Harry Corman? Do you know Harry Corman? Yeah. Okay. Many of you do. Now, before I actually tell you about this, oh, we have Miriam here. Do you know Harry? By the way, if you
Just a little bit.
just a little bit. Miriam's last name is Corman, just for just those of you wondering how she might know him. So I met this guy. For those of you who know Harry or know of his work, what do you appreciate about this guy? Please put it in the chat box. Okay. Some things that you know about Harry, or if you met him in person. Somehow there is something about Harry that you really appreciate. And probably because he didn't really travel a lot to different parts. Maybe not many of you know in this part of the world. I don't know if you do. But here's my very first impression. He got us to do something immediately. Oh, both of you actually say. Miriam, Pam, yeah, generous hospitality. Actually, that's so true. I stayed in their house. Yes, I think I probably used Miriam's room. And he is so sharp. And I think when I talk to him, I didn't know this, but then when I talk to him, I'm pretty nervous because I know he's going to ask me, where does it say that? Or what's the source? So I always had this a bit of like reverence for Harry. And one thing I remember from first meeting Harry and being his class, he talked about this Harry's Magic Square. How many of you know what that is? Harry's Magic Square is what I learned about how to take notes. As you listen to your client, how do you take notes? Really practical, isn't it? So then he talked about this. If you want to know more about it, either click on the link that when I share it, or just simply Google Harry's Magic Square. And there's this magic square that sort of looks like this. Have you seen something like this that I talk about? And he talks about problem box, miracle box, scale box, resources box, and he actually takes notes. But you know what the key word is in this particular exercise that he talks about? What do you see as a key word? What do you think is sort of like, it really stood out to me? What do you see there? Again, my background was in psychology, right? So I did psychology and the whole expert-driven thing, and I loved it. So I love being that expert and um, working in a clinic and talking about DSM. I loved it. And then this is probably my first time hearing somebody saying in their own words. You see that? In the client's own words, not my interpretation, not what I think that they said, in their own words. Really staying close to what the client says. That was Um, I didn't really notice that until later on, but it was right there in their own words. Write down what they actually say, not what you think you heard. So that was my encounter with Harry. And hopefully, as you listen to some of these things, um, I hope that you also think about your own mentors who influence your work. Yeah, and there are some mentors that I've never met, like Insu, Steve, never met them, and somehow we're doing this work. Yeah, and of course, here's a third person. Do you know this person? This person this was taken from 2013. But for those of you who know him, his name is Peter DeYoung. And yes, Peter. So, what do you appreciate about Peter? Either you know of all of his work, because here's the textbook that we're using when I walked into that wrong classroom. They were using, do I have it here? Intervene for Solutions by Peter DeYoung. And I remember this book being so expensive. I'm being a graduate student. I'm like, this is so expensive. And I debated, should I actually photocopy it? No, that's not, this and that. So fine, I will buy the books. I bought the book and I actually read it. And then I knew about his work well before I met him in person. And something about Peter, for those of you who don't know him, now he's somebody who wrote this textbook on solution focused brief therapy. I went to, I actually did my first presentation, I think in 2009 or something like that. I don't even know what I was thinking. But I thought, hey, I learned this. I can totally do a presentation. So I was doing presentation, one of conference sessions. And to my horror, Peter walked into my room. So I'm like, why are you here? Like, what am I going to do with you in this room? And he took out a notebook and he started to write some stuff down. I'm like, what are you writing down? You're going to actually give me like feedback about how horrible that was. And I had this like whole like internal narrative about how nervous I was. And then he took some notes. And then he came up to me afterwards and he started to ask me, like, oh, you said this. What do you mean by that? He was really intrigued by the stuff that I was saying. And I was like, are you kidding me? You probably have forgotten more than I actually learned about solution focused. And that humility, that learning attitude still is as strong as the first time I met him. And I learned from him this expression that when clients said something, we kind of like take it onto like cutting boards. And we sort of like pick and choose, listen, select, and build. And I was like, wow, this is not about questioning because I had a whole set of questions that I can use in coaching. What do you mean you gotta listen? I mean, I already have my next question. Hmm? And somehow he said, listen. Every time, listen to what they say that they care about, they want. Select that, build on it. Sounds so simple. So then I told him, it sounds so simple. And he said, well, it's really about you getting better at the basics. Yeah. So this is the photo from 2013, and he is actually stuffing the cards because he was volunteering to actually help out. Isn't that amazing? Like Peter came downstairs to actually stuff those like cards, and the card that he's holding up is Pam. So this is before you arrived, okay? So this is something that I learned. And that's why when I introduced the DOQ, Dialogic Orientation Quadrant, this is about a listening tool. It's not about questioning tool. So some people use it as, okay, what can I ask in quadrant one? I mean, I don't know what you can ask, but I know that you can listen for it. Listen for their different quadrants. For those of you who don't know what the model is, I'll show you in a minute. By the way, is this okay? Am I boring you? Is this even useful to you? I thought I'll just tell you a story, but I'm like talking. Yeah, you sure about this? Okay, all right. I mean, what else are you gonna say? Like, love it, of course. You're gonna say like hate it? Why am I even asking? And here, right, sitting right beside Peter, stuffing those like name cards. This is Jan Babeles, and the mother of microanalysis, and she's been publishing like since 1950s. And she's sitting there stuffing the name cards, and this kind of attitude, I think, is what we have in our community. So sometimes when I hear people um, show up and um, kind of like not sharing this kind of humility and attitude, I sometimes, yeah, it surprises me. So I hope that that surprises you when you meet somebody who's solution focused practitioner and full of shit. I hope that surprises you. Oh, it's being recorded. Shoot, I forgot. Anyway, this is Jen Babalas and 2010. 2 years after I learned this, and really by then I'm like, oh, I know this stuff, and I was teaching it already, and I'm like, I got this. So I'm teaching, going to different organizations and teaching them about blah blah blah, and then I go to this plenary. I think that was in Banff. I don't know how many of you were in Banff, SFBTA conference. This was their plenary where Peter and Jan they talked about microanalysis research, and I remember. It was and I think Pam, you were there, no? So entire room and half the room, they're like, and the other half was like, it's like people who got it, totally got it. People who didn't get it, they're like, what? Why are we talking about this? Right? Remember Pam? And it was just, we were part of the blown away group. And we're like, my goodness, this is amazing. And because they were talking about how there is a specific pattern in solution focused practices that is different from motivational interviewing, CBT, and other ways of working. Not that one is good or bad. It's just different. But then they were showing that evidence based on the narrative studies, microanalysis, the patterns that you see in solution focus. First thing is we tend to follow the client's language very closely. We also tend to preserve specific things more than others. And they actually went through those preliminary sort of early research articles that they published. And that was my first time hearing that, and absolutely blown away. And that really triggered my scientist sort of background. I was like, oh my goodness, we can actually measure this. They measured it, how much percentage, and they could actually do word count and so many different ways of working with narratives. So I was blown away. So of course, I had to take the post-conference training on microanalysis. And for those of you who think I just took it and got it and just went with it, this was my first time taking it. I actually took microanalysis training 4 times in total because I didn't get it. Yeah, my very first time. And here's something that Jan said in one of her articles. She says, more than one colleague has suggested that quick and dirty analysis would be just as good. I mean, curiously, no one suggests faster alternatives in other sciences, such as neuroscience, deep space, astronomy. I think, Danny, no one suggests that you do quick and dirty study, do they? And such as, other higher mathematics, nobody actually suggests quick and dirty. And she says, well, painstaking and time-intensive analysis actually is the norm, and why shouldn't it be the norm for our work? And she says, some things are simply not visible except at a micro level. And when she talks about it, she says in that same article, why don't we do slow and clean analysis? Any musician will tell you, slow practice. So those of you who practice music, you know what I mean by slow practice? Yeah. How many of you actually do music here? Musicians in the room? Okay. Just Danny, that's it? None of you actually do any music? Serious? Come on, we must have some musicians, no? And when you learn any instruments, or even like martial arts, okay? Martial arts. How many of you do martial arts? Okay, what do you don't do music, you don't do martial arts. What do you do with your life? Like, what do you do? Swim, swim. Okay. Okay, swimming. Okay, thank you. Finally, somebody does something. Okay. Oh, you do those things. Crochet. Oh, reading. Okay, maybe you have to get up and move, okay? Dancing. Helen says dancing, cartooning. Thank you. Now, when you think about learning stuff like this, okay, Nancy, hello, playing piano, you're a musician. So, Pam says goat yoga. And I think I've seen some of those photos. Uh, think about it. How do you get better at it? It's a slow practice, isn't it? Especially when you're talking about skills. The way that you get better at it is slow and clean practice. And that's something that Jan actually has been talked about for a very, very long time. And around that time, I thought, okay, here's what happened. I was teaching in different places, and because I was so excited about it, I called up all the nonprofit organizations around the area. By the way, I don't call them nonprofits because they do make profits. So I would like to call them social profits as one way of changing our labels, by the way. I mean, it's so funny. We call them nonprofit, but they do all the profitable work that profits humans, and we call it nonprofit. Anyway, I called all the nonprofits around the area and I said, would you like to know about solution focused coaching? And they said, we have no money to pay. No, that's okay. I'll come and do stuff. So I went to so many of those organizations and teaching them. And I think that's how I learned to teach from their questions. They asked me so many questions. And usually when people ask me questions, because I actually don't know the answer, I tell them, I don't know. What do you think? You must have a good reason to ask. It's not because I'm pretending to be humble. I actually don't know the answer to it. And I think that's the habit that I picked up teaching this. And one day I was teaching for this organization, and afterwards they said, who do we make the check payable to? And I said, what? It's like, who do we make this check payable to? And I said, I don't understand. What are you saying? They say, well, we have to pay you. And I'm like, no, you don't have to pay me. It's like, no, yeah, we have to pay you. And we have a budget for it. And I'm like, what? You're gonna pay me? And then I said, uh, you can just pay me by my name. And they said, no, there's one rule that we have to pay a company. And I thought, okay, um, let me get back to you. So I went and made a company. It used to be a university-based think tank research group, and then now with the same name, we incorporated as a company so that we can collect the check. So that's how Canadian Center for Brief Coaching began, and that's the building that we're still in since 2012. So some of you actually have been there, and I cannot wait for many of you to come and join me there. And we have summer programs and we have so much fun actually. And then 2013 is when we held the SFPTA conference in Toronto. Did you get this shirt, by the way? I'm wearing the shirt, SFPTA. It's Canadian conference. Does it sort of like make sense to you? You know how Canadians say A? So SFPTA, I hope you get, okay. Thank you for getting this joke. So this is that conference where we had some people still talk about this dinner as the Harry Potter dinner. So we are going to have SFPTA conference back in Toronto next year. So hopefully many of you can actually join. So that's my hope. Um, hey, so far, do you have questions? I'm excited to like, I feel like I'm showing you my like childhood photo album or something, you know? It's like it's photos and stuff like that. And so until really like 2013, I was busy learning and doing all the stuff, like SFPTA, and I got to meet all these people. And here is something that I noticed during that conference that I didn't really think much of it. This is Joel Simon. By the way, this conference was usually it's in November. And November in Toronto can be cold, depending on how you define cold. So I remember this November was not that cold. It was, pretty cool. It was a cool night. But our dear Simon Lee from Singapore, I remember him coming back from the conference completely frozen back to the hotel. He had to actually have a hot water. And do you remember, Simon, in the bathroom, you had to have hot water and wash your face to thaw. So it's not that cold. But anyway, I remember that. And this is Joel Simon talking about the prototype of what's known as opportunities. And they now actually have an actual book called Opportunities that just came out, I think last year or this year. How many of you know this work of Joel Simon and Lance Taylor? Opportunities. Yeah, Danny. So they look at, you cannot really see the script, but I still use this. This is so useful, by the way. If you're teaching or if you're doing, like, if you're just studying your own script, here's what the client says. You see, so they also stick really closely to what the client says. Something that's different about microanalysis is they will look at all the other stuff like gestures and even eye movement, but opportunities, they work with transcript. So this is what the client says. And then here is, well, this is what they actually said. So break it down to like small utterance units, right? And then after that, then you actually then come up with what are some of my response options? So I can ask this, I can also say this, I can say this. What about this one? When they say this, I can say this. So this is called opportunities. Slow down your response and take that time to generate more response options. This was one of the prototypes, I think, 2013. And I think a couple of years later, they actually do publish an article called Opportunities, but this is what they presented on. I still use this in my classes. This is so useful because we work with this one client narrative, which is only like 30 seconds long, but then you can spend the entire hour doing this analysis. So Joel and Lance are my mentors who taught me really how to operationalize um, and make it a little bit easier to stick to the client's language and come up with different options, response options, and then also analyze what are the assumptions embedded in those response choices. So this is your first time hearing about opportunities? Yeah, some of you? Please feel free to Google opportunities article. I think they actually made it available open access. So this is 2013 and they talk about this and I was just so blown away. And as you can see, there's a pattern of how I was introduced to solution focused in this way, interactional perspective, staying close with the client's language. And it just builds this way. It wasn't introduced as like set of questions to me when I was learning it. And this is Lance, for example. And he's, for those of you who know Lance, you may know Lance Taylor. And this is Lance and Wei Su. For those of you who know Wei Su, she actually won this award. And then they're hugging. So I learned these opportunities from Lance and Joel. And then this is Frank Thomas. For those of you who know Frank, how many of you know Frank Thomas? How come you don't know these people? Oh, some of you do. Do you know Frank? So don't ask me about why he's standing with, I don't know what that is, but anyway, this this is Frank. I don't think he does that every day, but anyway, I just got this photo from his Facebook. And I remember going to this SFBTA conference. You see, I got all these insights from conferences. And I remember sitting there. He was doing the closing plenary. And actually, for those of you who know Frank or his work on supervision and so on, could you please, um, Dwayne says all too well. So if you know him, please put it in the chat box, a few things that you really appreciate about him. And I call him my mentor, not just the content that I learned from him, but in so many different areas of my struggles, I feel like he was there as my friend. So when I was about to do something, and then I was like, Frank, I'm gonna do this. And he said, I don't think you should do that. Or he would always have that wisdom. And I remember sitting in this closing plenary, and he, you know how he took care of all the archives at SFBTA. So he has this wealth of knowledge that he's in a lot of videos that maybe not a lot of people in the world have seen. And he actually talked about this particular one that blew me away called positive fantasizing. And he was quoting this researcher. Her name is Gabriela Oettingen. I still talk about her almost every session that I run because their research is about how solution focus is not about positive fantasy, because positive fantasy leads to some of her research talks about how it was leading to increased psychosis, increased depression and anxiety. And also another article of hers talks about positive fantasy does not cause you to act. It actually relaxes you. So you are more likely to not act. And another thing that he talked about is solution focus is not evolving. He said it's elaboration, not evolution. And those two things, I remember taking notes, and I was like, oh my goodness, I've been telling people, I've been teaching people about positively imagine their future. But then the whole idea is positive fantasy can actually harm the client. So that was a bit of shock to me to hear that. Okay. What are your thoughts on that? Positive fantasy. I would love to ask you because, I've been talking nonstop. And I forgot my water. So, hey, what do you think about this positive fantasy or even solution focus elaboration? It expresses in different ways, but it's not evolution. It's not changing its core, but it's expressed in different ways. But this idea of positive fantasy, because I still hear some people using solution focus as like, imagine 10 years time. And that's actually an example of positive fantasy, right?
Uh,
What are your
Hey,
thoughts?
I have some thoughts.
Yes.
I'm not 100% sure if I kind of understand what you mean by that, but I guess what it reminds me of is when sometimes when you feel like you're having that, it does happen to me sometimes because I'm not always doing the right thing, and I feel like you get too far from those small steps
Mm.
that are tied into reality or tied into what's actually possible, and you start, like you say, what would it look like in 10 years if everything was solved? And
Oh,
it's not.
yes.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's actually what I learned from Harry. Harry Corman talks about how the future conversation is not about when everything is solved. Is that particular thing. There is that common project. You and I are working together. And that's something that he talks about, common project. What's our common project? Because it's not your life is everything is better versus that thing is more or less resolved. So then this idea of positive fantasy 10 years later, especially when you get people to even talk about their suppose miracle happens and all that good stuff. And then all of a sudden, by the way, this is my working condition. And I like this is so distracting. Like, what is going on, dog? Okay, so anyway, and when you even ask a miracle question and you do not connect it to their relevant past experiences, then that's getting closer to positive fantasy because they're going to leave the session thinking, well, yeah, that's when the miracle happens, but yeah, that's not going to happen because we didn't connect it, bridge it back to instances, as Chris Iverson will call it. So I think this idea of positive fantasy exactly is that when future is perfect or when everything is going your way. So when you phrase it that way, that's the danger. Yeah. So, hey, other thoughts about this idea? Because this was a pretty profound, like, sort of statement for me, actually. I was like, what? And feel free to put in the chat box as well, because I really hope that this is what I learned as I was sort of learning solution focus and refining it. And I wanted to share and really celebrate all my mentors. And I think this is the series that I actually did called Appreciation Class that none of my friends from this time zone could come. So then I thought, hey, I'm going to do this here. So, so here is the time that I actually started to travel to China, 2014. So it's around this time that I was traveling to China. And we have the circles. And I think, I don't know if Danny is here somewhere. Is that you, Danny, that we are hugging?
Yeah, that would be me.
Yes.
Uh,
So 2014 is probably when we first met, or 15, I think. And I was introducing solution focus, and Danny did such an amazing work of translating. Because I sometimes wonder how these kind of things get translated. And I think what I loved about how Danny was doing it is she not only translate words, but translate a context so that it was really fitting the local context. So anyway, I started to sort of teach there. But then you see, these are some scribbles from 2015 Beijing. And I take photos of all my flip charts. So here's what I have. And I was talking about scaling goals, outcomes, and you see some remnants of some of the things that I'm learning up to here. And there's elaborating preferred future. So you see some of these words showing up because that's when I started to study Chris Iverson. So you see some, how many of you know Chris Iverson or the Brief London team? Yeah, you do. Okay. So for those of you who know, this is a photo. It's actually a recent photo. It's not from 2015. It's actually from last year. So this is Chris. This is Harvey, and oh, what's his name? You know his name.
Evan George.
Evan, yes, 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 yes. So they're part of thank you for knowing. So the brief team, and when I was actually visiting, we got to actually have, and this is, I think this is Michael, isn't it? So we were anyway, this is IPA that we're drinking. So Chris Iverson, I met him. And first thing that impression of Chris Iverson, for those of you who know Chris Iverson, what do you appreciate about him? Or the whole brief team anyway. What do you actually appreciate about these people? Miriam, yeah, that was the first impression. He said something and I was like, you just met me and is that a joke? I remember I was like, that is such a good joke. And thoughtful, curious, absolutely humble and playful. Yeah. Thank you for sharing these, your experience of my mentors and all those words, absolutely. So Chris, it's amazing. I sometimes get invited to like speak to his class or something, and I stay because I learn something when they are teaching. I'm like, oh my gosh, I never thought of that way. So I'm still learning from all my mentors actually, but Chris came and here's one of the very subtle things that he talks about. So probably you heard this debate about best hopes from our session or best hopes for our session. Have you heard this debate a few years ago? And we had a pretty like nice debate about, is that about during the time, best hopes for our session, or is it best hopes from the session? I'm like, who cares? The client will not know the difference when they hear it anyway. But then it was really useful to pay attention to it because orientation, when you are intending to say best hopes from our session is after the session is over. So then it's not about what happens with me, but it's what happens after the session in your life. this was a really important distinction that I finally got when Chris talked about it. And the term preferred future is, I think, what I got from Chris, because before then there are different ways of calling it, but preferred future are the terms that I actually picked up from Chris, but especially this distinction from what happens during our time or what happens after our time when I am no longer in your life is the concept that I actually got from Chris Iverson. Feel free to actually put in the chat box what you learned from them, some of the concepts or some of insights or things that you learned from this group or Chris. Please share with each other because we're still learning, right? I hope that somehow they get to watch this and then know how much we appreciate them. And remember this, that Peter Drew, and that best hopes from became very clear to me after connecting with Chris. So when I actually look at my 2015, this is a drawing from a flip chart. And this is the progress clues and signs of progress. So those are the words that now I'm introducing. And pictures get complicated. You see, now that I talk about it's not during, it's after the fact, then you see the best hopes from, and you start to see impact of people that I'm reading or studying at the time. And then after 2016, then I talk about something like this, that on a scale, this is your past, this is the now, and this is the future. So here's the past and future timeline. And then here is something that sort of looks like a quadrant showing up. And this is 2016. And like, I love this elaborate things. So then I remember talking about this with different rhyming things. And so here's a board from 2016. I don't know if you can hear my dog barking, but my dog is barking. And here's a day that I was talking about, based on Chris's work, I talked about prefer future in detail. I think this is Danny's writing, is it? Okay. And then here's what I actually called spiral model, right? So this is before the quadrant, and this is where you begin with best hopes, and then sort of make the contract. You see, contract is Harry Corman's language, common project. And then you go to the preferred future in vivid detail. See, again, Chris Iverson. Instances of successes. So you go to the past. And then you go to so anyway, this is kind of like the spiral that I was talking about for a couple of years, actually. And it was a little bit confusing, but I liked it because I didn't have anything simpler. And I think what happened was, these are different ways of doing it. And I took photos of each of the flip charts. And now this image happened. And this is the drink break that same day that I was talking about the spiral. And Danny went to washroom. Okay. So Danny, because I mean, it's all day course. And Danny's like, you know what? I need to go to the bathroom. So she went. And I remember that. She went. And then, of course, people in Chinese students they don't break. So they come up and they ask questions. I'm like, sure. And I don't remember who that was, Danny, but somebody asked me the question about, so we talk about what they want, like good things. And so he didn't speak English, I don't speak Chinese. So then we had to really keep it simple. And I remember drawing this on the board and I said, it's kind of like this. And I said, here's the past, and I put it together with the present and past. Here's a future. Here's what the client says, positive and negative. And then we have this quadrant. And really, it just came out like that. And then even the numbering, I did it this way, 1, 2, 3, 4, this way. So we talked about it. And he's like, oh, I got it now. And this was the very first time that I drew something like the quadrant for the first time. So 2017, and I thought, wow, I really like it. It makes a lot of sense. So this is how it developed over time. And the reason why actually you see some of these titles as this is because positive content and negative content are the languages that are used in microanalysis, specifically by this woman. Do you know this woman? How many of you actually recognize this woman? We usually recognize men, but do you recognize this woman? Take a wild guess. Who is this? By the way, this is the woman I'm talking about. This is not a woman. This is Harry. So, who's this? Hmm? You don't know? Ooh,
And I know her. She's from Las Vegas, I think, but I don't remember the name.
Yeah, I mean, there's a name tag right there, but
I can't see it. Oh, it's so blurred.
Sarah.
Oh yeah.
Yes, Sarah. Sarah's work. And she has published with other people, but in her article, they specifically talk about positive content and negative content of the client's narrative. Again, we're going back to this idea of what Harry talks about earlier about in clients' own words. And not only their own words, but then now Sarah, informed by microanalysis, they talk about positive content and negative content. This is the vertical axis of the quadrant. So for those of you who might be wondering, where does it come from? Every single part of the quadrant is informed by all these people. You see? So this one is one of the earlier publications in, I don't have the book here, called Handbook of Social Construction Practices or something like that, by Sage Handbook. And in that book, this is actually presented as positive content and negative content. And then also quadrant is now named properly 1, 2, 3, 4 this way. And this is because of that influence by, what do you call it? Microanalysis. So you see the language is reflected very closely. Do you have questions? What questions do you have as I just walk through like the whole history of it? Or comments or questions? I wanted to show you this because in case you have some questions that I had, or somehow you struggle with some things that I did, because I was not really fully bought in to this because it sounded too positive, right? So every struggle that I had, these mentors actually walked me through. And why the numbering? Because Laura, I actually used to like number it however way I want. Like you can see that number was like 1, 2, 3, 4, like this way, or 1, 2, 3, 4. So then I'm like, okay, for me to do it properly, I need to number it properly. So I actually looked up. I remember looking up, Googling, how do you number a quadrant? And proper numbering actually is starting from the upper. I don't know why math people do this, but this is how you actually number quadrant properly. Any math teachers here? Like, why do you do this? I mean, wouldn't that make more sense to go from this anyway? So that's why. And even the naming of this actually is different. But here's one version of it when I presented in Malaysia. And I just called it good stuff and not so good stuff. But then again, positive or negative or good or not good, we are still inviting people to judge that, right? So I was not so comfortable with it. But then what was really useful is when I was talking about it, now because this is so simple, that we can simplify learnings. So I actually got to read about, I've never met him. I got to read about his work and his thesis actually. And his thesis is can questions be therapeutic? And then he asked these questions about, what are the functions of questions? Functions. And that was the key word for me. Not only we study forms of what people do they ask a question? Do they make statements? But more so, what are the functions of what we do? So instead of actually memorizing questions, which is a form, we need to study what does that do, which is a function. So this is a functional analysis. So what Dan McGee actually talks about in his thesis is that this movement is called, from bottom quadrants to upper quadrants, so to speak, is called resource activation. And then from like when client is talking about really good stuff, but then you do something and it functions so that client's next narrative is talking about misery and all those things, then you just activated problems. So this is called resource activation. This movement is called problem activation. And I was like, this is so useful. Those two sort of distinctions, but that's not Dan McGee's work, and I could not find references for the longest time until last week, when actually I don't think Bev is here, but when Bev she did a keynote presentation in Amsterdam during a conference, and she actually had the reference, and I'm like, thank God, that's the reference I've been searching for in the last, seriously, like 5 years, and it was right there. So resource activation and problem activation, that's the language that I actually got from Dan McGee. So these are different ways of how you can think about who and how, like who informed how I do my work. It's a really useful reflection, because when I was doing this, I thought, gosh, I'm so thankful. I don't know if I actually ever sort of like send them a thank you email for doing this. But every single part of this refining process of DOQ, of every change, it used to be called regretful past, but then I met with a pastor's group and who said, well, in the past, not only there are regrets, but there are also, guilt and shame. I'm like, good for you, you're in the right profession. And then I had to find something that can contain all of it. So I can actually just call it regret. So then I changed that to trouble past. So you see some of the changes happen. And then and then also the quadrant 4 used to be called fearful future. And this is one of the publications. But then one that I like the most right now is what's included in my book, Coaching A to Z. And this is, I think, the cleanest way of presenting it. So this is how it got refined over time. And I think I don't have to show any of those things. But then here's what happened. I was so excited about it. And I was doing this team coaching, whatever, in Hungary, Budapest. And I was doing this session, teaching them about the quadrant and so on. And there's this one guy who came up to me. And this guy actually looked very curious, and he looked serious. And he said, you know what, my name is Klaus. And I want to actually ask this question because I have something very similar. And I'm like, what do you mean you have something similar? What do you mean? I was like, because I heard it so many times. Like some people are like, oh yeah, I think I came up with it. I'm like, yeah, you wish, right? I know there are similar things like Paul, and actually they're legit ones like Mark McCurgo, Paul Jackson. They talk about it in their book, like that model. Yeah, sure, I've seen that. But then when people come up to me and they're like, oh, I have something similar, I'm like, just, ugh. But then he said, no, let me show you. And he showed me actual publication that I didn't know about. And it looks so similar. I was like, this is like the same thing. Oh my gosh. And he's that humility and gentleness that I so appreciate about Klaus, is that he didn't assume the worst of me. He actually wanted to learn together. And he asked me this question. He said, how is this different? Oh, that was one of like, oh my goodness, I don't know how this is different, but only by talking with him, I realized that Klaus actually has very similar framework. And he talks about values and positive, negative values and so on. And it's really similar. But then he was using it as what can you ask? Questions that you can ask. And then it became very clear to me only after this conversation that the dialogic orientation quadrant is really about sticking to the client's language. We don't analyze questions, or we don't actually come up with questions, but this is a listening map. So Peter DeYoung, listen, select, build, or Jan Bavalas, or staying close to the client's language, like Harry. So Dialogic Orientation Quadrant became very clear to me that this is the listening map working with the client narrative. So I put him as my mentor because this conversation refined it. And I still thank him every time I see him. I saw him just last week and he gives me like big hug and like such a gentleman. I just wanted to include him as somebody who taught me about the model, right? And then here is the last piece. I can't believe I just went through all 12 mentors. I didn't think I could, but hey. And some familiar faces. And I would actually put both Jennifer Gerwing and Sarah Healing as my mentors. But in terms of actually development of DOQ, I chose Jennifer. But really, I learned from all four of them. And Sarah Healing is the one on the left. She does a lot of work in healthcare and brilliant work looking at narratives, especially exchange between clinicians and patients and so on. Jennifer Gerwing, and this is at the Montreal conference. So they presented and it was really fun actually. Montreal, just city itself is really hip, right? So we were quite excited. And we had dinner, so conference dinner together. And I was sitting with Jennifer. I was so happy because I didn't really know her that well. And I was excited to tell her about the models. I'm like, oh, Jennifer, this is what I have. And she just listened. And she's like, uh-huh, uh-huh. And until then, I thought this is a solution-focused model or framework. And she said, no, this is not solution-focused framework. Because you can study any conversation or interaction using this model. And I'm like, that's true, actually. Yes, you can. And then she used the word, this is a heuristic of interactions. Does that sound so sophisticated? So I'm like, I'm sorry, you're what? And then I had to write that heuristic. It's a heuristic. It's a tool that helps you to learn. And this is the term that I learned from Jennifer. And she called the DOQ for the first time. It's a heuristic of interaction, also as known as meta model. This is a meta model that we can use to study all the other models. And that was the turning point for me, because then how we apply the DOQ right now in the larger field, larger communities, larger than the solution focused. This is very well known in major platforms like coaching.com, Institute of Coaching, and this is introduced as the meta model. And these are some applications of DOQ that I am still learning about. And I love it when people actually tell me how they're using it. But so far, this is what they're using it for. But my favorite one, not that I should have a favorite, but I do, is when people use it for research. It gives me so much joy when people are doing research using this. So I just wanted to show you the development and my learning, especially appreciating all my mentors along the way. And I think I can't wait to really collect more mentors, because I still learn and I'm still really discovering what else is there that I didn't see before, especially when you do slow and clean research. And I mean, I can go on about this model, but I wanted to share that with you as my story or journey of from micro to meta.